Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So, where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So, if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. Hi, Dominic.
Hi, Jenna.
How you doing?
I am doing good. How about you?
I'm hanging in, it's been a time, but I'm hanging in.
Yeah, I know. I know we check in every day and we're just like, yeah, getting along.
Well, there's days, there's good days and there's bad days. Like this is,
Yeah.
unemployment
Is
sucks.
So is today a good day or a bad day? Because I feel like yesterday was a tough day,
Yeah, yesterday was definitely a tough day. Definitely got the wind knocked out of me yesterday. Not anything specific happened. Um, just I guess taking in the totality of the situation.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was like
same.
a lot to absorb. But yeah, today's a much better day, I definitely had a good night's sleep, drank a lot of water, did some meditating, did some yoga, and definitely have been downing the ashwagandha root. So all of those things together, today is a much better day.
I went to go see Legend last night.
Oh, hello.
Do you know do you know Legend? The 1985 Legend with Tom Cruise?
I
Oh
do.
boy.
I
Are
mean,
you it's a trip.
was this like one of those re-releases in the movie theater?
Yeah. Yeah, they were doing like a little I guess they sort of have what do they call it? It was basically you get to decide, the audience gets to decide whether it's a
Wait,
classic.
a
It's
choose your own adventure movie?
well, what happens to it afterwards? I guess it's a movie theater here in Brooklyn called Nighthawk. And
Okay.
I always go to them or I go to Alamo Draft House and it's basically you get to choose whether it's a masterpiece that should be remembered or if it's something that should be forgotten. And at the end, we all had to vote for it. And I voted to keep it as a masterpiece.
Okay.
It's entertaining.
It sounds
It's
it.
yeah, I did. So I never yeah. So it's fun seeing that in the movie theater. So yeah, it's been I know it's been a you got to do some stuff to sort of make sure mentally we
Yes.
still are keeping ourselves sane.
Yes. Yes. I thoroughly agree with that. Keeping your sanity is definitely the name of the game here.
Yes.
Well, we have some headlines for this week.
Yes. Yes.
It's been a week of, well, I mean, it's always, I say that every week. Oh, it's been a week of headlines. Every week's a
I
week of headlines.
and there's always something different going on in terms of this is not so much about layoffs, but I guess more so about what's happening within the industry,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Do you want to start off with the
Sure. I'll start with news dropped that Gannett and McClatchy, who owns Gannett, who if you listen to our last episode, that's the wild part. Right
yeah?
after our episode with Margot Suska, then this news drops. So McClatchy owned Gannett newspapers is dropping the Associated Press. Now, what exactly does that mean is not 100% clear. So I went to very trusted source for all things journalism related, and that was Pointer. And so Pointer published an opinion piece by Tom Jones, not the singer. And at least I don't think so. Anyway.
You never know.
Well, I saw that when I saw the name. I was like, Tom Jones, but then, I mean, come on, how many Tom Joneses are there? All due respect to Tom Jones, a Pointer. Anyway,
Yes.
um, but yeah, so going through the whole thing. So first of all, this apparently came as a shock to AP. They did not know that this was going to be happening. But a lot of times when companies, as we learned from our discussion with Margot and also just from our own career experiences, when companies decide to do belt tightening measures, it comes as a shock to everyone who was not in the boardroom making that decision. So the question seems to be is can the Gannett papers continue to offer robust news coverage without using AP content, which, let's be real, subscribing to the AP can cost a lot of money. Yeah, so
Mhm.
some news organizations do, some don't. But so here's the thing. A Gannett spokesperson said that this decision will enable them to further invest in their newsrooms and leverage their incredible USA Today network of more than 200 newsrooms across the nation to reach and engage more readers, viewers, and listeners. Still, again, it's a statement, but it's kind of broad and still kind of vague. So it sounds loosely, you could read into it to assume that, like, okay, so this money you're not spending for your subscription to the AP, you're going to reinvest it into your newsrooms, which sounds great. Um, but at the same time, a spokesperson for the AP also said that, again, like I said, they were shocked and disappointed to find out that the Gannett papers were going to be dropping them, and that their conversations with Gannett seem to have been productive and ongoing, which again is usually the case when, a big belt tightening announcement is made. I thought we were making progress. We were fine, but we weren't. Um, and so anyway, they go on to say, they'll continue to support. They remain hopeful that Gannett will continue to support the AP beyond the end of their membership, which is at the end of this year. So all in all, it's not exactly clear what this shift means, but it is another big shift in the industry that again seems to be refinding its footing, or I think as you said, it's sort of re-evolving into something else.
Yeah, I know they mentioned that they're still going to keep the APs, right? I think they're still keeping their AP's polling services.
Yeah.
And and I agree. Like, and I know they also the AP has said that because of that, actually newspapers account for only like 10% of the business that they're making money from. So they don't see this as having as big of an impact on them.
Hmm.
But I agree. Like, I don't know. It's like we were talking about this story. It's like you really don't know what this means just now. I mean, it sounds weird. I agree. It's like, what impact will it have on smaller towns and smaller cities? Um, what
Who
impact
are
does it have?
already bereft of
Mhm.
local news coverage.
So it feels very, I don't know, but at the same time, it doesn't, it's nervous. You get a little bit nervous in terms of like what
Again,
can
I
this have a
think
lot
it's
bigger?
that ongoing, like, okay, well, this is how we have done it.
Yep.
So not doing that, like, again, it's not exactly clear what they plan to do and how they plan to fill this information gap.
Yeah.
Um, in theory, reinvesting in hopefully hiring more journalists, paying them properly, as we also discussed with Margot, things of that nature would be really, really good. I would
Mhm.
support that, but it's not
Mhm.
clear that that's what's going to happen. And I don't think
Exactly.
anything's going to be clear because I think their contract doesn't, like I said, doesn't end until the end of this year. So we really won't begin to find out probably until maybe about this time
Well,
next year.
well, actually, I think I don't know. I thought I read that they might start March 25th. I think that's
Oh,
when that's
really?
if yeah, I'm pretty sure it's somewhere it says March 25th that they said the contract doesn't go till the end of the year, but it's actually March 25th if I'm correct. But um I
Well, then
agree.
that's even more interesting because, again, this is a presidential election year.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
this is
there's a
where
lot of down ballot races that need attention. So we'll see what happens.
yeah. Um I guess now we'll go on to our second story, which
Hmm.
is um so this is about well, the headline is University of New Hampshire reportedly set to eliminate journalism major from English department. So now uh, this is in boston.com. And it's journalism education will continue at the University of New Hampshire, but staff will take a more interdisciplinary approach. Um, this was first reported, they mentioned here in the Boston Globe, and they talked to the College of, well, it's a College of Liberal Arts Dean Michelle Dillon told the paper that the University of New Hampshire is restructuring and reimagining how it handles journalism education. So basically what they were doing before was journalism was part of, the English department, and it was mostly focusing on writing
Of course.
and as a major. So students who are still part of it right now are still going to be they can still have they can still go for their degree right now, but then I think they say in 2025 is when they're looking to start the new major will have to go through the university's curriculum review, and we expect it to be ready for the 2025-26 academic year. They're still supporting journalism, but they're
Mm-hmm.
doing it under journalism slash digital media. And so it's incorporating digital media because they realize they're looking at the market right now and they're seeing how, listen, this is what is predominantly happening right now. We
Mm-hmm.
have to focus on what can get people jobs, and that is the fact that, and it's still journalism. But I do know there are some people who have gone on, former graduates from this school that are just concerned that there's going to be less focus on writing and more focus on the digital aspect and losing some of those skills. But again, it's kind of a wait and see. We just don't know. We'll know more once they get the curriculum approved and maybe once we start seeing what's happening. But they were seeing less students were applying to become journalists. They noticed like a
I mean,
decrease
given
in,
everything that's happened, can you blame them?
yeah. So it makes sense. But you definitely don't want to lose sight of the fact that you want to embrace new media, you want to embrace the changes that are happening. You just don't want to lose out on what are the main skills of journalism. And that, of course, is writing. And hopefully that's something that can still be maintained and while evolving. But I guess that's a kind of wait and see also.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a wait and see kind of thing. Um, I will say that I've heard this from numerous people who work in academia that they have noticed a distinct shift in with their incoming freshmen of the past few years that kids don't know how to write anymore. They just don't. Like the written word seems to be done. And I think maybe that might be what's really triggering people is that this is another step towards the I don't want to say eradication, but I don't know, like as if we're evolving past the written word. I don't think that's actually going to happen, but it's certainly not as prominent as it used to be. And again, you have this push and pull between ideally what you want something to be
Hmm.
versus where the market is.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
people are not consuming their news and their information through the same traditional. I mean, yes, they still will read stuff online. That is definitely true. I've seen more than enough social media content creators with a green screen of somebody else's article behind them talking about, like, and this said that, and you can see all in here and pause to read the whole. I've seen that, but at the same time, um, I've also seen in the job market that more and more, uh, you know, even legacy media institutions, they're looking for someone who can do more than one thing. Are you a multimedia storyteller? Can you handle more than one platform? I think a lot of journalists have already proven that they can. I mean, my God, we've all managed to pick up all sorts of skills in the name of keeping ourselves marketable and making sure that we can get the stories that we are telling to as broad of an audience as possible. But I guess what I'm saying is that I understand why this is triggering, but I also understand that if you're really going to be a J school, it's not enough to just teach the kids how to do journalism. You got to teach them how to be able to survive the business.
Yeah. Totally agree.
It's my long-winded explanation.
Well, so I guess now we turn our sights to our interview with Victor Pickard.
Oh, speaking of
Um,
a professor,
I know. Joining us now is Victor Pickard. Uh, Victor is a professor of media policy and political economy at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is also the author of Democracy Without Journalism: Confronting the Misinformation Society. Victor, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Now I want to start off with because what really brought you onto my radar was I saw an interview that you had done with another journalist, and I believe you used the quote, "Capitalism and journalism was always a match made in hell." And given Dom and I, our current circumstances, I was like, okay, that's somebody I need to talk to. So just tell us a little bit about what exactly you meant by that.
Sure. So I did say that. It is a very dramatic statement. And I understand, it might come across as a bit startling, if not shocking, especially for an American audience. But what I was really trying to do is draw attention to this relationship between journalism and capitalism, which is something that, to the extent that we think about it at all, which I don't think we actually do think much about it, we would generally see it as just the natural order of things. And I'm really trying to underscore in all of my work that the media system we've come to inherit here in the United States was not inevitable. It's not natural. It didn't have to be this way. And I think to see how our system has become so captured by these kinds of capitalist logics really should give us pause. And I'm trying to just get us to think more critically about that relationship. And indeed, I'm sure we're going to get into this during the discussion, but I think many of the problems we're grappling with today, whether it's the implosion of local journalism or the continuing problems facing our public media, or even things like surveillance online, the idea that the fact that these social media firms are constantly violating our privacy, these all can be traced back to these commercial imperatives. And so that, I'm just trying to get people to have these kinds of conversations like we're having right now about like what's happening, how did we get here, and what could we do differently to get out of this mess?
Well, Dom, do you mind if I take the next one?
You got
Oh, okay, all right. Because now what I really want to know is trace back to how far back are we talking and what are these commercial imperatives that you're referring to?
Sure. And you at least historians should be a little bit careful in drawing like fine points on exactly when did this shift happen. And so I'm certainly going to hedge a lot by saying that this was a gradual structural transformation, but I
Frog
think it
boiling in the
helps.
water.
That's right. That's right. And I think now we're at full boil. But if we think way back, so to give one example, so Americans generally assume that our media system has always been commercially supported, that it's been predominantly a commercial media system. But if you look back to the earliest days of the press, when we think back to like it's say late 1700s, you had this discussion in the Congress about, how do we make sure that communities, far-flung communities, rural communities have access to the press system? Now, I want to be clear, it's not, they weren't the most enlightened people. They weren't really concerned about everyone having access. There were
No.
large groups of people who they didn't care so much about. But what I do, for all their flaws, what I like to underscore here is that they did not assume that the market alone would support our media system. And so they had these massive postal subsidies. The postal system at that time was essentially a newspaper delivery infrastructure where well into the 1800s, up to 95% of the post was made up of newspapers. So it wasn't just letters home to mom. It was about, it was basically disseminating news and information across the country. And the government said, we can't trust the market to support this. We need to subsidize it. In today's dollars, it would amount to tens of billions of dollars. So, that shows that it was a mixed revenue model. They had some advertising. It's important to point out that a lot of the earliest advertisements were for enslaved people. So it's, this
Mm-hmm.
kind of racial politics was bound up in the early press system, but it was mixed across various sources. For example, the parties, we've heard of this is the partisan press era, right? So the major political parties of the time were supporting news outlets that were sympathetic to their political causes. So it wasn't a purely commercial model. They were getting these postal subsidies. They were also getting printing subsidies from the government. The government would tap particular publishers to print out official notifications and documents. They had some reader support, what today we'd think of as subscriptions or newsstand sales. but advertising itself was only a relatively small segment of their broader revenue model. This gradually changed throughout the 1800s as we shifted from what's called the partisan press era to sometimes referred to as the penny press. That's not really my favorite term for it, but I think what was happening was that the press was beginning to radically commercialize, so that the advertising revenue became this inordinate amount of money that they were reliant on. Up to like 80% or more of their revenues were coming from advertising. And this worked to varying degrees of success. It made a handful of people very wealthy. It was a very profitable industry for about 125 years. But once we move, and I know I'm jumping ahead here, but I'll cut to the chase. I won't leave your listeners in suspense. Once we move to the internet, where newspapers no longer had this kind of monopoly position, where if you wanted to advertise for anything, you had to go to the local newspaper, this business model came apart, and it's never coming back. But because it worked for so long, people just thought there's no other way. There's no alternative to this kind of heavily commercialized, advertising dependent system. And so we're still trying to think our way, think outside the box. I'm arguing for this paradigm shift, but I think we have to see the market as part of the problem, not the solution to the journalism crisis that we face today.
Wow. Wow.
That was long-winded. I apologize.
Well, no, but I mean, so many things came to mind. I mean, okay, this is a tangent on the tangent, but oh my God. Is there a chance that when you mentioned that, some of the advertisements were for, human chattel, enslaved Africans, that when, more printing came in and advertising, were some of those advertising dollars coming from bounty hunters?
They probably were. I wouldn't have, numbers for you, but yeah, I wouldn't be
I realize that's
surprised.
something that hasn't been, it just dawned on me anyway. All right. Dom,
Yeah,
you're up.
certainly, like runaway. Yeah, definitely. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I'm
Jesus
sure there were.
Christ. Okay.
Yeah, and that's a
Dom, you
part
are
of our history. It's like when I try to denaturalize the system that we have today,
yeah.
it's really important to trace back, this kind of white supremacist political project was very much bound up in the early press. And even as much as we mourn the loss of local journalism, and I think we should for many reasons, we also have to be very clear-eyed about the unsavory history. And oftentimes even these family-owned newspapers that we often romanticize, these were local elites. These were, they were doing their own bad things in many cases. So that doesn't mean, I guess this leads me to say that from, as this old model crumbles, we should dare to imagine something better coming out of the ashes. Like, we don't have to romanticize what we once had to try to imagine something better in the future.
I'm all about that.
Victor, one solution that it seems people have been talking a lot about have been like either the billionaire own people who take over, and people think that they will just step in, or at least that was up until recently when they also have had to lay people off at their papers. But like, explain to us why that, even though they have the billions of dollars behind them, why even for them they have to lay off, and why that doesn't really work, and why that isn't a solution in terms of, and the same thing goes for, we had on Margot Suska on last week to discuss how there are private, there are hedge funds, there are private investment firms that are also buying this, and people are buying newspapers, and why this doesn't work. Like, nobody coming in and investing, just saying, I'm going to take over, I'm putting all this money into it. Maybe at first blush, people think that's the solution because, oh, good, finally somebody else can handle all the losses. But why is that not the solution?
Yeah, excellent question. And Margot has a new book out that really gets to the bottom of, especially the hedge funds and the private equity firms that are swooping in. But that alone should give us pause when basically all smart capitalists are vacating, are retreating from the field, except for the hedge funds, the private equity firms, and a handful of billionaires, sometimes referred to as benevolent billionaires, which of course begs the observation that they're not always so benevolent, and at the very least they might have short attention spans, and they might suffer sticker shock as well when they are losing tens of millions of dollars a year to try to prop up their pet projects, as we see with Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. So, I think this should give us pause about who is actually seeing any future, any potential profitability in the newspaper industry in particular. And, we spend so much time talking about the newspaper industry, but there's a reason for that, I think, that goes beyond nostalgia. And it is for the simple fact that even in its beleaguered state, the newspaper industry is still producing most original news and
Mm-hmm.
information that permeates throughout our entire news media ecosystem. So, even if we're gleaning our information, and in most cases we are from places like, social media feeds and other outlets, it still traces back to this dying industry. And, it's these reporters who are introducing new facts, new information into our social worlds. And those are the jobs that are disappearing. So that's really about, why we talk so much about the newspaper industry. And it really seems like we're at a point of no return for the entire industry. And as you both know, it's not just the newspaper industry, it's all the digital startups. We were just talking earlier about, I guess, Deadspin just laid off
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of people
Mhm.
today. I hadn't even read that yet.
No, the news
Um,
is coming so fast and furious. It's head spinning.
Yeah, I think all these data points are showing us that there really isn't a profitable model for many kinds of journalism. I won't say all kinds, but many kinds, especially the kinds that we know democracy requires, like local journalism, coverage of the city hall, coverage of the school board, coverage of a state legislature tends not to be the sexiest news stories. It's not clickbait, it's not selling advertising, but it's precisely that kind of journalism that we need for democracy to survive, and that's what's disappearing.
Well, I
But
do
you're
want.
right. What? Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. What I was just going to ask is um, that also can depend on where you are in the country, because Dom and I are based in the New York City area. And of course, just because of the nature of New York City, our local city politics, even our state politics, I feel like it gets much more attention than if you were in, say, a Kansas or in a Missouri or something. Not to pick on the Midwest, but I'm just saying that there isn't the gravitational pull that you have in terms of attention and eyeballs as you have in New York City, or maybe in a DC or something like that.
That's true. And, when we talk about these expanding news deserts, where often we look at those maps, I mean, a lot of them are in rural areas and outside the coast. Although I think arguably a lot of people would say even in New York City, there's not enough local, like actual local coverage as there
Mm-hmm.
should be. But definitely, once you get outside the major cities, it's a huge problem. Although I think it's important to point out that news deserts, as worsening as this problem is by the day, I think we could argue that there have always been news deserts, especially for communities of color. Like there have always been entire groups of people that have been disenfranchised from this commercial media system, largely because advertisers don't see them as being profitable audiences in some cases. But that's what happens. Going back to your earlier question about those commercial imperatives, if it's profit above all else, and if the main part of that business model is to deliver eyeballs, to capture audiences and sell them to advertisers, like that's going to create various kinds of redlining, various kinds of media market censorship. So, I think these are all systemic problems that are now kind of blowing up, but they've always been there.
Um,
Oh, I forgot my question now,
oh,
Jenna. Sorry.
sorry.
I
Yeah.
hope I'm not depressing you guys too much.
No.
We're already
No.
laid off, dude. We've hit rock bottom. Well, one of the things that I found so interesting in some of the articles that I had been reading about you was your suggestions of how we can fix it. And I guess as a journalist, I'm a little bit wary of the idea of introducing government into news media.
Yeah, that's completely understandable. And you wouldn't be surprised for me to say that this concern invariably comes up in these discussions, especially when I'm floating some of my more radical utopian ideas about creating public media centers across the country. But I do think, I mean, going back to what I said earlier about the postal subsidies, media subsidies are as American as apple pie, and this idea that government isn't involved in our media system is a libertarian fantasy, right? I think government is always involved in our news and information systems. It's a question of how it should be involved. Should it be there to facilitate profits to a handful of investors and media owners and advertisers, or should it be there to help guarantee a baseline level of news and information for all members of society? And in my radical, which I don't think is really that radical, I think it goes back to what we all learn in school, that democracy requires a free and by implication a functional press system. Really, it should guarantee all members of society are able to engage and not just access news and information, as important as that is, but also tell their own stories, create their own media, express themselves in the media system. And I think all these things are ideals worth fighting for, that we're not going to get there if we think a handful of billionaires can somehow save the day, or even looking at some of the foundations which are beginning to really funnel desperately needed money into local journalism. And I think that's actually a sign of hope, but that's not enough, right? And I think that we, like any kind of systemic fix to this problem, is going to involve massive public subsidies. We just have to make sure that it's from the ground up, right? It's a grassroots process, and it's not just simply someone up on high, funneling money to their preferred outlets. It's got to be content and ideologically neutral across the board. I think this is something we can work for.
Interesting enough. I mean, because it feels like our news has become, in many ways, has become so divisive, and it's become so polarized. How, when you look at what people respond to on social media, so how do we look at that in terms of moving forward, where something like that could exist? Because it feels like, when you pick a neutral side now, that is kind of viewed as just not being something. Often people often love headlines, clickbait, things that get people's attention. You look on social media, that's so how does that necessarily work? Does that also, is that a shift within how people are going to be needing to consume their media, which is kind of tough to sort of change? Like, how does that happen when we're so used to right now being so divided in terms of the media that we consume?
Yeah, it's excellent and daunting question. I don't have an easy answer for that one, but I'll do my best. I mean, I do think that what you just described sounds a little bit more like a demand side problem, and I do think there are demand side problems. We have to make sure that it's not like we can just build something and people will come to it. We have to make sure that it engages diverse communities and it reaches communities where they are, at least meets them part of the way there. But at the same time, I do see this as primarily a supply side problem, in that, we all know there's tons of commentary out there, and the casual observers often think, we have more information at our fingertips than ever before, but it's not actual journalism, right? It's not people actually
Mhm.
digging up new information and really confronting social problems. And also, it's not just about information, but it's about creating solidarities. It's about creating communities. It's about collective action problems. When we think of things like the climate crisis, like these are things that as a society we're going to have to grapple with, and see all of ourselves as a community having all much at stake for in having a viable news and information system. So I do think that if we are producing it, it will filter out through the media ecosystem. And in my the crazy utopian ideas that I throw out there, so if we had these public media centers, for example, in every community across the country, those would be public, not just in name, but actually owned and controlled by local communities. So there would be this constant dialogue between the journalists and the communities themselves. And so I
Mhm.
see that as a way to build trust over time.
Okay, well then I have to ask, especially considering Dom and myself, but definitely myself, most of my background has been with public media. So don't we already have that? Or do we not? Is public media not hitting that mark? Or is it the business model that it works with right now? I mean, what's the difference between the public media that you're talking about and when we hear public media, what so many of us automatically go to: public radio, public television. What's the difference?
Yeah, so all those things you just said are all true. Okay, so I'll tease them apart a little bit. But first of all, so I do, when I'm thinking about this future public media system, ideally I would like to build on those public media infrastructures that we already have, that we already enjoy. I think they do a lot of good work. And that's something that we can try to build on, but we'll have to repurpose and restructure. But I also think, and Jenna, you were noting this, that there are problems, very serious systemic problems inherent to the particular kind of public media system we have here in the US, which really is kind of a misnomer. It's not truly public, or at best, it's sort of a hybrid. It only gets a small, or a relatively small amount of its revenue from public subsidies. A lot of its money is coming from private capital, from individual donors, from foundations, even from corporations. And I think that gets at the business model problems that you mentioned. Like, I think we need to change that. I mean, it starts to defeat the purpose of a public media system if you're reliant on corporate sponsorship, right? Like, that's not what a public media system. The public media system was supposed to provide an alternative to these commercial logics that we were talking about earlier, where there shouldn't be a concern about generating advertising revenue or reaching particular audiences, making sure that that these corporations are happy and reaching the audiences of their choice. So I do think we need to move away from that. And if we look internationally, and you've probably seen these graphs before, where the US is almost literally off the chart for how little we allocate towards our public broadcasting system per person per year. It's about $1.40 at the federal level. According to this year's budget, we've now inched up to about $1.58. And that is, like, compare that to the Brits, who spend about $100 a year per person for the BBC, or the Nordic countries spending far more than that. And it shows in the robustness of their public media systems that really can serve as a kind of social safety net when the commercial system fails. They're there to cover some of the important stories. So I think that's something that can be an aspiration. Even just to rise up to global norms would translate to tens of billions of dollars for our public broadcasting system if we were to live up to those benchmarks.
There are some people who will say, though, listen, if you're an outlet, you should be able to make it on your own. And look at the New York Times as an example, due to their subscription services. And I think others have tried that. But yet, why is it that so few? I mean, I really don't believe that so many people we're inundated with subscription services, and it's so difficult to have smaller ones get recognized. But I mean, so how does something explain a little bit, I guess, like why the Times is so successful with what they're doing, and why at the same point it's so difficult for smaller or even other large entities to sort of carve out that space?
Yeah, I mean, the New York Times is really in a category of its own for many reasons, but according to their business model, they're really one of the only newspapers that can sustain itself on that sort of paywall digital subscription model. And there's a number of reasons for it. I mean, they've been very crafty with, funneling people in through games and recipes and what have you. But the most important fact, or the difference here with the New York Times, is that it's not only a national newspaper, it's an international newspaper. It already had a massive audience. So if you have just a percentage of your readers willing to pay for their subscription, for their print media, then that's going to translate into a viable model that doesn't rely so much on advertising. It's work, I used to say it also worked for the Washington Post and it worked for the Wall Street Journal, but both those papers have had recent layoffs. And even, I don't know if it's always going to work for the New York Times. It might work for niche outlets, if you get small, and we're seeing some of these outlets pop up just in, recent months that are quite exciting. But they generally are going to be able to focus on, relatively narrow issue areas that they have a readership that's very excited about those issues. These aren't going to be the outlets that are covering what's happening down at the local school board. Those are, those kinds of stories just aren't going to get picked up by these models. So I keep coming back to that argument that there really is no commercial future for a lot of the news and information that we need.
I kind of want to go back to what you were talking about in regards to this idealized public media, because um, as Don was saying, with our polarized politics and everything else right now, one of the other things that we're seeing is that one thing with the introduction of social media, you have a lot more of, at least when it comes to headline writing towards something that's going to get an emotional reaction out of people. You like, it's not necessarily just about facts. You want something that's going to get a rise out of people. They're going to stay on the platform. And then also with the so much more editorial, at least, content out there, a lot more people are having difficulty differentiating between, as you were saying, actual reporting and journalism and analysis and opinion. It's just all one giant mess of noise for a lot of people. So if that's the direction that we're going to go in, it almost seems like this requires a, I hate to say re-education, but sort of like re-alchemating people to what it is that they should be expecting from their local newspaper or their local public radio station or something along those lines.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that it's going to have to be a process where, it's another one of those things where I try to remind us that, audiences are not just are not just created, out of the air. They're cultivated over time. And if it's based on this dialogue. So to give you one example, so back in the bad old days of the 1970s, 1980s, when broadcasters, radio broadcasters, had to do this thing called ascertainment, where they had to go into local communities in order to hold on to their monopolistic use of the public airwaves, their licenses. They had to go into local communities and canvass them to find out what did those communities want to hear and see on the public airwaves. And in order for them to hold on to these licenses. And so that's just one, that was a policy that was thrown out during the Reagan administration, but it was this, way of making sure that media outlets stayed in contact and dialogue with the communities that they purportedly served. And I do think that, if we start really trying to cultivate those relationships where, people won't just be looking for the most, sensationalistic headline, but they will be able to say, like, no, what's happening in our own backyard is actually quite important. Or there's this toxic dump, a few blocks away. I want to know more about that. Who's responsible for that? What are the health effects on that? Or where can I vote? Or is it safe to go outside during a pandemic? Some of these things are life and death issues. And I do think people care about that, not just celebrity gossip. Although, there can always be a fair amount of celebrity gossip too. That's important. But yeah, so I don't think it's inevitable that that's what audiences will always want to consume.
All right. Well, one of the other things that I had considered was the idea that because journalism being enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution has always been with us, that it's something that I think perhaps the public just assumes that it always will be. I mean, Dom and I obviously are going to be much more sensitive to the headlines of, Vice closing down and Deadspin being gone and this one laying off this percentage of journalism, blah, blah, blah. But for other people, I'm still able to get, some stories here. CNN, for example, is still on the air. So is there a false assumption that this is something that's just always going to be there and be available? And will people not realize we didn't know what we had until it was gone?
Yes, unfortunately, I think you're absolutely right about people taking it for granted. And even though we do learn in school that democracy requires a press, we rarely have conversations throughout society about, what are, like the press doesn't just happen, doesn't fall from the sky. It's something that, basically we create through policies, right? As a society, at least according to democratic theory, we're supposed to be deliberating over these issues and designing media institutions and systems and infrastructures that serve democratic society. And I do think if we can raise awareness about this, and it's also, I think people feel generally disempowered, right? They feel like there's nothing we can do about this. It's a shame, but this local newspaper is no longer profitable, so it's just going to have to close shop. And we would never say that about our local public school, right? I mean, public schools have plenty of problems, but I don't think we would say, oh, it's no longer profitable. So now the people living in that community don't have the right to a public education. And I think that's a kind of paradigm shift that we need, where people need to feel like that's part of the social contract. And, we have a say in this, or something we can do about it. And just because the market isn't supporting our local newspaper or the media that we need, doesn't mean we should just let it wither away. And I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, now that I've been working on this issue for a couple decades, I have seen this, I've seen baby steps, at least, in the direction of, people are waking up. They actually do care about their media. I mean, we have survey data showing, even among political conservatives who might hate the media, when you talk to them about their local media institutions, they actually have warm, fuzzy feelings. And this is true for conservatives and liberals alike. They feel strongly about their local media institutions. So I think there are leverage points we could try to use to, get people to think this is a problem. We've got to fix this.
What about, Jen and I were just talking earlier about, I saw there was something online regarding, it was a Reuters study and looking at how Gen Z is consuming their media and how they want to, I guess, consume their media. And a big part of it was just talking about how, they don't want to see media consumed the same way we've been doing for so many years. They want more transparency. They want more in terms of, I guess, just a certain type of less neutrality, more. How does that? How do we then, with what you're talking about, how do we kind of navigate how this is going? Social media changes this model a little bit. Newspapers are one thing, but how do you sort of navigate it changing again, evolving, which it's always been evolving, but this is going to be a bigger change than what we've gone through 20, 30 years ago. So how do you
Yeah.
Yeah,
look at
it's not
that and
just
how?
platform, it's
Right.
editorial now that they want to change.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so we are in a very different media environment, and yet some of our needs are still the same. All societies have certain critical communication needs that need to be met. But how we're consuming media is changing. So I do think this is still a problem for policy. But this is a wicked problem. And I wish, I wish I had this magic wand where I could just make the platforms do this. We need to find ways where we can compel them to platform reliable news and information in their feeds. And right now they're doing the opposite. They're
Mhm.
moving away. They're starting to move away entirely from amplifying news and like news media, professional news media. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, but we need to compel them to, algorithmically, platform reliable news and information. Now, there's always going to be debate about what is reliable news and information, but, let's have that debate, like that, let's have a vibrant discussion about that. But I do think that right now, and again, it's largely because of these commercial imperatives, right? That's not, they're trying
Mhm.
to keep eyeballs glued to various screens. They don't care about informing us. They don't care about democracy, and I mean, that's how they're wired, right? They're not bad people, bad institutions, but they're commercial entities. And so, they have a fiduciary duty to maximize their profits, and that's what they're going to do. So we have to find, that's the role of policy, to try to make sure that they do things that are good for all of society and not just for their bottom lines.
Well, Professor, before we let you go, one of the questions that we always try to ask our guests is how did you become, I guess in your case, would be a professor of journalism, or media studies, but how did you come to this? Like, everybody's got a different path that led them to feeling as though something related to journalism was their calling. So, just out of curiosity, do you mind sharing with us what was yours?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's a long and convoluted narrative, but I'm going to give you the summarized version, which is, after college, I lived in Japan for a few years, and then I traveled for more than a year after that, just backpacking throughout various areas in Asia. And I saw firsthand some of the implications of American foreign policy And I thought, this is stuff that I didn't know about. I didn't learn about this from my media. What's American media doing? And this led me down this path to realize that whatever your first issue is, whether it's the climate crisis or mass incarceration and growing inequality, your second issue really does need to be about the media, because you're not going to get very far on your first issue if you don't have a media system that's conducive, that's providing all members of society with the news and information they need to confront these wicked social problems. And so I keep coming back to that idea that, if we care about democracy, if we care about any of these wicked social problems, we really have to care deeply about our media system. And that's what I've staked my career on. So I'll keep plugging away at this.
Well, we definitely thank you for that.
Yeah, we do, because it's such an important issue that I think a lot of people just don't realize how important it is. Things sort of, get lost, especially online. What's in, it's really difficult for people to understand how important it is when you don't hear the stories that are being told out there from all the different people, all different sides, all different opinions. So thank you for really trying to come up with some type of, solution to this problem. It's a complicated one, but it's one we have to talk about in order to get there.
All
Right. And
right.
thank you both for having these kinds of conversations. You're doing God's work, in my view, and I want you to keep having these conversations. And we also need to make sure that we have jobs for all people like you, all news workers out there. So as a society, we need to keep working on this.
Absolutely. All right. Well,
Thank you.
Professor Victor Pickard, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we will continue to follow, I guess, more of your work coming out of the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay, so having heard that interview, having done it and then heard it, okay, he put forward so many great ideas. He really did, like really great ideas. I guess the one that I'm a little stuck on is the idea of the government stepping in to uphold journalism. And again, yes, this is a critical part of American democracy. I guess my thing is this: there is so little trust in our government right now. And on top of that, our current Congress, it, there's not a lot of trust.
Do you
There's not a lot of
think?
trust in them as a body. There's less trust in a lot of them as individuals. And the ability for our current government as it stands to support a critical eye looking at not only them, but any, like, I mean, for God's sake, Washington is crawling with lobbyists. Like,
Yeah.
does that mean that, like, for example, articles about, I don't know, like the pharmaceutical industry, like, well, we're gonna, but oh god, that article, it just, because some lobbyist is in somebody's ear just being like, kill the story. I don't know, there's just things that I'm like, would that really work?
I think there's a lot to I think it's a great idea. And I
I
know
think it's
he
a
brought
great idea.
I know he brought up other countries that do this, but it is different here. It's
Yeah,
and I do think the fact that, I just don't know if you can get all sides to agree. And even with public media
unless it's
receiving some
banning
funds.
TikTok,
Yeah.
they can all agree on that. I'm
Well,
still
not
stuck on that. Not
yeah,
because
well,
I'm
not
like such a huge fan. I mean, I am on the platform. It's not, it's just because, like, this is the thing that you
the
guys can all come together on.
and that is all. But again, I think that for what he's pitching, I get it. You try to think of what if this is a way of actually trying to, there is an investment within the country in telling, responsible journalism. But I don't know if it's something that could get the support of all sides, because I do think it is divided.
I don't
And
think we're
there
the same country that,
no,
yeah. And on
no,
top of that, to be perfectly honest, because I think we've touched on this before, is that the voices who are able to, because I mean, okay, there was trust But there was also a very limited number of people who were even given the opportunity to be storytellers, to set the tone of what the conversation would be. That has, rightfully so, in my opinion, broadened, but that means that a lot of the not only the status quo, but these systems and levers of power are getting challenged. So I guess what I'm stuck on is that I just don't understand how our government supports that.
Yeah, it starts a really good conversation, I think, for us to, but I don't know realistically if it's something that could happen, at least right now. And
Mhm.
again, you're looking at, this election year, and just the idea of pitching this idea of, I just don't know if that's something that can happen. But again, very interesting. It's somebody tossing out something that, trying to, maybe there's something within that concept that could actually, I just don't know right
Which
now if,
brings us back to our Samantha conversation, is that it's the ripple effect.
yeah,
Somebody's got to throw the pebble into
yeah,
the water and let the ripples go. So I give absolute props for that.
yeah, yeah.
Because
Um,
I mean, like, it's very easy to be a critic. It's, much more vulnerable to be like, okay, well,
well,
what if we try this?
it's just like Margot last week, talking about, I think what we're hearing, are just looking at the business model that we have right now for journalism, and
Mm-hmm.
that it's not working. It's not working in terms of, for the journalists
Mm-hmm.
being compensated, fairly compensated, for your work. It's not working in terms of all these layoffs that are happening and being able to sustain a living. And it's not working for also the news that, is being put out there, in the sense of, you have a large community that, we've discussed this, like, you have different communities who are not getting the news that they deserve. The stories are not being told.
Yeah.
So there is a problem that needs to be addressed. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not really. And so you have some people trying to start a conversation, and hopefully people are listening. And hopefully we're part of this process too, of sharing these stories, because even if we're not saying they're 100% solutions, but at least they are people who are talking and offering up some ideas of what we can do, to change this from getting any worse.
You know what this is all making me think of is a lot of the young people. Oh my God, I'm so old. The young
when we
people,
start
but
when we
no.
start saying that, I know.
but
Jenna.
but seriously though, like, I hear from a lot of them, and I validate completely a lot of their frustrations around our economy and our society and all of the problems that we've just allowed to fester and stink for decades, because I don't want to deal with that. I understand, but then some of them jump to this, like, burn it down, just burn it all down kind of thing. And I mean, again, I wish more people were paying attention, not only to us, but seriously, to what's happening with journalism, because we are in a place where we are
Mhm.
having to reimagine how this could work. And there's some ideas that are going to work. There's some ideas that aren't going to work. There's, like, people will coalesce behind maybe something that feels more familiar than they are something that seems way out there that doesn't feel familiar. But my point is that reimagining something or rebirthing something is scary, it is daunting, but it also requires a lot of trial and error. And I guess that's one of the things that's just sort of coming to mind, is that, like, a lot of these kids who were like, that's it, burn the whole thing down. Totally get where you're coming from, but after you burn it down, then what?
Right, right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's what, right now, what we're seeing is, it hasn't been fully burned down, because, but there is, we're seeing an industry that is definitely reeling and trying to figure out, how do you survive it.
Hmm.
And the people, as we've discussed before too, people who are still in it, who are also nervous and trying to figure out, where do they fit within this new formation of journalism, media, um, and not really being sure, because rebuilding something also takes time. And
Hmm.
a lot of us, it's great to say, but it's like, takes it it could take years. And what do people do in that meantime? And how do industries move? And because again, this is no matter what people might think, you need journalism. You need the stories. You
Exactly.
need to hear like this is not, because or else how else do we communicate with one another to know what's happening in our neighborhoods, in our country, in our world?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm not saying it's all going away, but you know, you don't get to hear some of those stories being told that would otherwise maybe alert you to a problem that's going on. And there's just a lot. So I
Mm-hmm.
hope again I hope there's a lot for us to think about what we can do moving forward. So um
Absolutely.
do we go to our spotlights now?
I think we sure do.
Spotlight's back.
Spotlights,
Yay.
yay! I know. Okay.
Journalism spotlight. You want to start, Jenna?
I will start. Okay, so my spotlight article was a piece that I came across in The Nation by Mark Bayard, and it's not so much an article as much as it is a review of a new book that came out. But here's why it caught my attention. The article's title is Black Punk Means Liberation. And basically, it's a review of this book, Black Punk Now, by Chris Terry and James Spooner. Um, and what I found so fascinating, first of all, another great thing about journalism is that, like book reviews and cetera, things like that, alert you to, like, oh, I didn't even
Hmm.
know that this book exists. Okay. So, punk music for a lot of, I think most of America, we associate with working class white kids. And because that's really when like it exploded. And I mean, I'm not a music historian. I would say that from my opinion at least, punk came out of ska. Ska is part of a Caribbean, almost Jamaican sound tradition. Ergo, it's another offshoot of black music. Everything is. But my point though is that because it's so associated with working class white subculture, to be a black person within that subculture is like a subculture within a subculture. But it's also it's also about a different way of experiencing or expressing the black experience. And so for myself as a albeit middle class black kid growing up in a predominantly white small town in the Hudson Valley, I definitely gravitated towards, bands like Bad Brains. And because I didn't really see a whole lot of I there were white punk bands for till the end of time, but I didn't really see a whole lot of people who were also like engaging in that same kind of music, which was fun, but it also was a release of anger, and it was a very critical eye a lot of times to the world that we lived in. Um, and you didn't always see that. I mean, you saw it in or especially early hip hop. Like that was one of the things that attracted me to it so much, was that it also had like a punk edge, but
Hmm.
it anyway. Um, Bad Brains were my favorite. That's why they come to mind the most. But anyway, so the point is that I was like, wow, somebody wrote a book about this thing that like, had been my super secret thing that I loved. And, you know, I also didn't get a chance to, I mean, I knew other black punks existed, but I think I didn't get a chance to meet that many others of us, and I'm guessing that a lot of us sort of existed in these sort of like sub bubbles, either by ourselves or with two or three other people, so we might not have been as aware of a community. um but for the kids now, because they've got the internet and they've got social media, etc., they're able to coalesce in a much easier way and see each other visibly in a way that didn't exist for me in the 90s. And so yeah, I mean, the it sounds like a really fascinating read. Um the book shows the varieties of punk identity and its genres and its modes of expression, but of course it's not just a book about music, it's about how punk, like I said, is a subculture, and black punk as a subculture within the subculture can be an incubator of radical ideas and forms of expression, of which music is only one small, albeit loud, sliver. And then a quote that being black and punk challenges the idea of what people think black, quote unquote, is supposed to be. And that in and of itself is so punk. And that just, it spoke to so many of my own my coming of age as a teenager. Because again, like when I was a kid, punk music, grunge, hard rock, that was huge.
Did you go to a lot of shows? Did you go to a lot of live shows?
Oh
Or
my
did you go
God,
to,
I lived for that stuff.
do you ever go, have you ever been to anything today or currently? Do you ever go to live shows today too?
Well, recently I haven't been to anything because I've
Oh,
been.
well, I mean, within the past 5 years, even before COVID, did you
Yeah.
ever go? You did, yeah. I mean, I love going to see live shows. I think back in the day, yeah, it's funny that you go. I mean, I think like for me, it was just a very interesting time. Like punk music was, because I remember when grunge sort of came about and it became
Hmm.
so popular. For me, it was with Nirvana, the remembering when
Hmm.
they first came
Well,
about.
that's, I mean, that was really like the tip of the iceberg because like if, and now I'm being a bit of a purist about it, but if you were sort of like paying attention to underground whatever, there was like a ticking of like all of this stuff that had just been building. It was only a matter of time before one of those bands broke through.
Yeah, and also I think it was I mean that kind of music too was just like I'll be real like back then I think I was more of a pop. I used to go see different bands because my friends, but I was always more into like the pop. It was when as I got older, I started finding older music that I wasn't as aware of in terms of punk too. And just seeing the subculture at all. There have been some interesting documentaries, but that book sounds
Hmm.
fascinating, Jenna.
Oh, it
And
totally does. And it like there's so
I want to go see a
much.
show. I want to go see a show with you now and see and us go to a punk show. I know a
Well,
few places.
I'm sure you do. I'll say this. Um, I'm trying to think. Most recently, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. But the point is that none of us are as young as we used to be, and so like the last
Uh,
show that I saw where there was a mosh pit,
I
it
was
was
gonna say,
so not what I like. Because again, people are older now, and like I really cannot afford to have you shoving me, and I don't really want to shove you, and like it's not the same thing.
it. What
It was everything shy of people like stretching before they got in the pit. Like it was just.
I I went to go see this band called Amel and the Snippers at
Mm,
Brooklyn Steel. They're uh, a punk, I guess they're a punk band or a punk pop band. It
mhm,
depends on who you talk to. But I'll call them a punk because I thought they were punk. But I saw there was a big mosh pit and I was in the back
mhm.
because well, I'm going to say this much too, though. Even when I was younger, I would never have been in the front of a mosh pit because I'm very brittle. I will, I will just disintegrate if I get thrown around. I know that. Like this body cannot sustain anything. So I'm like, I'm very delicate.
Okay, so we're gonna have like a side, maybe another episode where we can talk in more in depth because I can tell you there's like almost like I don't know, there's the mosh pit and then there's little like rings around it and like in
Yeah.
terms of safety. I'm dead ass serious.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yes. So that's why. But we're going to have to go to one and we'll update the audience. We'll take a video and
Oh
we'll
my
update the
God.
audience. They'll love that. Um,
Your spotlight article.
So my spotlight article. Okay, now I have to freaking find it because I was too busy talking to you about. Um. So okay. So my pick is a podcast. Surprise, surprise. Because I keep telling you, all I do. I mean, I always listen to my podcast when I'm running or doing stuff.
I encourage people to listen to
I
podcasts.
know. Please listen. So WBUR has a new podcast and it's called Beyond All Repair. Um, and so I listened to their other podcasts. That's how I found this one. I listened to their other podcast, Endless Thread, and one of the hosts on that, uh, Severston, she is hosting this, and it's a 3-year investigation
Mm-hmm.
into a woman who was well, I'm going to read from their press release over here.
Okay.
So it's a 10 episode podcast, result of a 3-year long investigation into a cold case that's ripped a family apart, a woman who wasn't believed, and a search for the truth that will leave you questioning everything. And it's so basically in conversation with uh it's basically a pregnant newlywed who was accused of murdering her mother-in-law, and the person who accused her of murdering her mother was her own brother. They went to trial, and this tore her family apart, not just in terms but her family apart. She has another sibling, a younger brother, and I'm only 3 episodes in. Episode 4, it drops weekly, and there's only 10 episodes, but it's fascinating. And I told you, I'm not a true crime person. A lot of them, I honestly give me anxiety. Um, but Amory, she really has a way of telling the story that's deep. It goes beyond, it's a lot about this family, the dynamics within the family. And, she even says in there that she went into this not knowing who to believe. And at the end,
Mm.
you're going to know what she believes and where she lands on this story. Because again, this far in, you don't know all the details. Like, I cheated a little bit and I went on Google and tried to find out about the case because me, I got to spoil. But
Curiosity.
yeah, but at the same point, I am allowed. I don't want to say anything to the listeners because maybe that's something that they want to go into. But this story is really fascinating about this case, and I highly recommend it. And I think they just do a great job of telling human stories and kind of meaning like just not just telling the crime aspect and hearing the sensationalism, but it's really about the family and trying to get to the truth. So I highly recommend that.
Cool.
And yeah, I guess that's it for this week.
I think that is it for this week.
You, you know what next week is, all right?
It's number 10. We did
Episode
10.
10.
I know. Yay us.
Yes, episode 10. So that'll be some what of a surprise. Maybe even to us.
Well, listen, because we're gonna go back to our original where we're gonna be having in-depth conversation, you and me. And yeah, I mean, we're not in the same place that we were initially.
No, no. So it's gonna be, yeah, it'll be fun. And then we're looking forward to it and sharing some of our thoughts and what we've learned and how we've grown over these past like 10 weeks. And thanking everybody for who's been listening in and finding us. And we appreciate it. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for commenting. It really is so appreciated.
It's super appreciated. So big, big thank you. And all right, until next week then.
Until next week.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Domenic and Jenna Flanagan. Music provided by Jay Cowett. Research by Lori Rothenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.